So here we are. This COVID thing continues to cause delays and detours. Stephen coming down with it caused his family's normal celebration of the holiday to unfortunately take a detour, as well as Julia's living arrangement temporarily. My sister Jill and her husband were in Perrysburg, and they had long planned a dinner, a get-together with friends that they've known when they lived there. In the final hours, their daughter, her friend's daughter, was diagnosed. So another detour. Of course, the situation with Andrew has caused a detour in his celebration of his wedding with Tanya, and unfortunately with her contracting pneumonia, it's further detoured, as well as those who are going to be attending this celebration are detours as well. Things just kind of tied to domino. I assume many of you can point to similar detours. These detours are often unexpected and all too sudden, and they often call for a plan B, even before a plan B exists. I am here before you as a plan B. I'm so done with this COVID thing, but we all go on, as you're a witness to right now. Let's continue with our look at the book of Acts that Julia read. Paul was a prisoner. He was actually rescued by the Romans from the Jewish leaders who wanted to have him killed, basically for what he was doing with the Gentiles. As he claimed to be a Roman citizen, he requested or demanded a trial before Caesar in Rome. This also gave him a free ticket to Rome, courtesy of the empire. So we now find him aboard this ship bound for Rome. And continuing with with verse 13. Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Caudia, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat, or lifeboat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw out the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was lost and abandoned. Now, this detour was no normal storm. The language being used here indicates that the ship was up against a typhoon, and given the type of ship being a single-mast cargo ship, it was no match for such a massive and severe storm. Notice how Luke reports that they could not see the sun during the day or the moon at night. In those days, that's how they navigated. They had no way to navigate and really couldn't, even if they could see the sun and moon and stars. They were totally helpless, blind and hopeless. Something else is going here on the ship, another strange occurrence. The prisoner is slowly gaining credibility and will soon become the commander of that ship. There's something about a good leader that when difficult times occur, good leaders rise to the top. They don't shrink back, but stand up and lead out of danger and trouble. Paul has already told them that the trip was a bad idea. It's like a, now I told you so moment, but he's going to tell them something else. Continuing with verse 21. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God, the God that I worship. And he said to me, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you and all those who sail with you behold, God has granted you and all those who sail with you. So take heart, men. I have faith in the God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.' When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, they had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow." Notice that by now, Paul is the captain of the ship. His warning had fallen on deaf ears. Now Paul has heard a word from God that he and those with him will be saved from the storm. Paul has such a strong faith that regardless of what things look like, he believes God more than even his own eyes. He perceives that they are still in danger. His senses say, "You are all going to die from this massive typhoon, but God said you must go to Rome." There's potential here for a struggle in faith. But if God says Paul will go to Rome to preach the gospel, Paul is going to Rome to preach the gospel. I pray we have the same sort of faith that believes what God says as we find it in the Bible. He was living by faith and not by sight, and so must we. Paul tells everyone that they will not die in the storm, but that everything will be lost, including the ship. God told Paul that he was going to Rome to preach and that everyone with the ship would be saved. An important principle, that even lost people receive some level of blessing from God because of their association with Christians. Everyone on that ship would live because they were on the same boat as Paul, and God wasn't through with Paul yet. However, there is still much to do. God works in cooperation with humanity. They still had much to do. Paul told them to get something to eat because you're going to need your strength. The worst has still yet to come. God works through his people. Our efforts are not in vain. Paul was weary, but he knew God's will would come to pass, and he also knew that they better eat to stay strong. In verse 39, continuing. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on it which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or pieces of the ship. And so it was that they were all brought safely to land. Paul trusted God and could thank God for their safe harbor while still in the midst of the storm. Are you trusting God's promises? Do you trust God even when things don't seem to be lining up with what He promised? Can you give thanks even while in the midst of a trial? I certainly believe we all can answer in the affirmative. God's will be done. Amen.